Hello, I am Pastor Nate Mason, and I am talking with the legendary Emily St. James. Emily, why don't you share a little bit about yourself, where you come from, your career, a little bit of history?
Legendary. My name is Emily St. James, as Nate just told you. I grew up in Armour, South Dakota. I was born actually in Michigan, then I was adopted to a family in Armour. You probably don't know where Armour is. Most people don't. It is um, about a half hour south of Mitchell, which is where the Corn Palace is. People sometimes know that. It is named after the man who made the hot dogs. So for a while, our high school fight song was the hot dog song, the Armour hot dog song. I don't remember all the words, but it was Armour Packers. That what kind of kid loves Armour Pack? Yeah, so you get it. I have been working as a journalist since 2005 and have been branching out into other forms of writing as well. But if you have heard of me, it's probably because I have written TV criticism and other forms of journalism for many, many years, basically since 2009 when I got a job as a TV critic at the AV Club that very quickly became even more. Yeah, that's the overview of my career and life so far. I hope you enjoyed it.
There we go. Wonderful.
Yeah. Yay.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I want to talk to you, well, the main reason I want to talk to you is that we are old friends. We went to the Governor's Camp for the Gifted, the South Dakota Governor's Camp for the Gifted, which, by the way, the good Heath Weber has transferred that to Morningside College in Iowa. So not only is it in my current home state, it's also at a college of my denomination, United Methodist. So we're
Wow.
just moving on up, right? But back in
Yeah.
the day, we were high ability students. That
Uh-huh.
quotation's for me, not you.
Uh-huh.
And that's kind of how we had a connection. So it's been kind of fun for me to watch your career progress. From afar. But you have that's such a fascinating take because what's the beat you currently work for at Vox?
Yeah. I write about what is called shifting American identities, which is basically just a way for me to get to write about people who are in a variety of interesting sort of situations and intersections of American identity. Right now, I'm working on a piece about the report that came out of the Southern Baptist Convention about sexual assault and abuse in that congregation or that denomination. And I am also working on a piece on indigenous land rights acknowledgement from people who are living on land that was not ceded to them. And I'm working on a thing about the trans woman at the center of the Dave Chappelle special you may have heard so much about last fall, who lost her life and sort of how he has used her as a token to like make his himself seem more cuddly, I guess would be a way to put it.
Yeah, yeah. So from my perspective as a small town pastor, I see the world is advancing in some ways very very many wonderful ways. We are recognizing the inherent spiritual worth of our LGBTQ community. We are recognizing that gender is a lot more complicated than we thought growing up.
Right.
Um, and my congregation, I have two of them. The average age is usually over 60.
Mhm.
With the exception of one family, they are 100% white. So I'm seeing outside in the world this beautiful blooming of diversity, and within my professional life, I see a group of people who feel like they're left behind and they don't understand.
Mhm.
What are some ways, if you have any insight on how can we take an aging congregation or aging church denomination even, and how can we better connect them to the world as it's growing so we can be connected, so we can feel like we're part of it and also be significant in its growth?
That's a good question. It's always a tricky question. When we look at the rise of marriage equality in the
Mhm.
United States, the single greatest predictor of whether you were going to become a supporter of marriage equality was if you knew someone who were themselves gay or lesbian. And that became, if you had a friend or a family member in your life who was a person who was affected by these policies, then you were like, well, they don't seem so bad, and it was easier to extrapolate that out. Now there is a corollary to this, which is that the rise of support for marriage equality almost exactly tracks with the run of the television show Will and Grace.
Oh,
So
really?
within art and storytelling, there is a place to build real empathy. And I think within the church, you see that in the parables that Jesus told, like the fact that he found it more useful to convey these messages through storytelling, I think is really it really helps us understand the ways in which telling those stories and getting to see people who maybe fall outside the traditional norms that you're used to is a way that we can build empathy and build bridges. And as a writer myself and as a trans woman, I will out myself at this point in our discussion. As a writer and as a trans woman, I think there's immense power in this kind of storytelling. I honestly this is the second conversation I have had with a pastor today about this accidentally, just like as part of my work, I talked to a different pastor. And he was like, I have changed a lot of my thinking on this because I have been following you online all these years. And like, I'm not saying that to say I'm just that great or just that amazing. I'm saying that to say, when you know someone and you see how personal that issue is to them and you see how deeply rooted it is, then it becomes a lot harder to sort of accept the line of other folks, whether in Christianity or outside of it, who say, define me by, I don't know, trying to make me out to seem like some weird deviant, when like, if you look at me, I am an extremely boring white lady. I just want to be clear. I shop at Target, and I'm wearing a friggin' cardigan sweater. So yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that it begins with storytelling. So me as a pastor, I need to tell these stories, share this
So
witness.
yes. I think the second you turn it into a series of rules, it becomes scarier. It becomes like, oh, I don't want to mess up this rule. I don't want to mess up that rule. And then it's just natural for your brain to be like, why do I have to learn all these rules? It is easier for you, who have been introduced to me as a woman named Emily St. James, for at the start of this conversation, whether you clocked that I was trans or not before I said I was trans, and maybe some of you follow me online, I don't know. It is easier for you to just inherently think of me as a woman and use she, her, and all of that. Now, that leaves aside my non-binary siblings who have a different sort of road they have to take, and I don't necessarily want to speak to their experience, but it certainly is a situation where, when you see a person, just try to treat them like a person. And if you screw up, they will hopefully tell you, if you are in a space where it's communal and driven by friendship and fellowship and conversation. There are still people who occasionally misgender me. It's very rare. It happens when people know that I lived some portion of my life as a man. It doesn't happen with just random strangers anymore. But they correct themselves and move on, and it's okay. And it hurts for a second. I won't lie and say that it doesn't, but just correcting yourself quickly and moving on is the best way to handle it, because that shows that you understand you did something wrong, but making a big deal out of it will just make it worse for everybody. I just gave a bunch of rules when I said that we shouldn't start with rules. See, look what I did.
Yeah. Well, that and also too, since we are both from South Dakota and I'm speaking to you from the Midwest, that any slight perceived infraction, a Midwesterner has to apologize for at least 45 minutes. It's just, it's in our nature, right? But it's one of those things where, not my current congregations. My current congregations are lovely, and I'm, contractually, required to say that. But in the past, I've heard a lot of very condescending, very, very angry things. I think that from my experience in my setting, that the trans community is taking a lot of the brunt of the xenophobia right now, a lot of the
Hmm.
hate,
Hmm.
because it's just something that I think a lot of them don't have experience with and don't just simply don't understand.
Right. Hmm.
But at the same time, I know that when I hear people make these really hateful comments, I worship with them, I sing with them, I pray with them, and I know that if a trans person were in the room, they would be a different person entirely. So
Hmm.
I think that there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. I mean, especially since you're an expert for media and all that stuff. But when you know someone, your attitudes change. But that kind of gets to the whole moral dilemma of how do we expose these isolated congregations without, I don't know, bringing in the token, without
Yeah.
exposing someone to potential harm and potential judgment. That I'm of the attitude that the church needs to get itself right, so that way we don't cause harm. But at the same time, how do we expose them to someone so that way they can
Yes.
have that relationship?
Well, obviously, I need to go on a speaking tour.
Absolutely.
That's what I need to do. No,
Every pastor wants to take a Sunday off, so you are welcome anytime.
you know what? I could probably just come up with a sermon off the top of my head. I don't know. I don't know. I don't. Here's one of the things I think is the dilemma here. I don't know that I should be required to educate everybody I
Yeah.
know about all trans stuff ever. But also, if I don't, they're going to Google these questions and get just terrible answers. So the compromise I've come to in myself is I'm not just going to walk into your room and say, here's all the ways that I am and you should treat me and all of that. I might walk in and, if you ask me a question, I will answer it to the best of my ability. I don't know everything. I don't know everything that's true about gender. I know that we have increasing scientific understanding that gender and even sex are way more complicated than we thought. And it's really easy for me to say, okay, here's an obvious example of both. Non binary identities clearly exist. They are valid people who are living lives that don't fit comfortably within the gender binary that we have set up for centuries or however long it's been. And we could dig into the history of gender, but let's not do that right now. And that's an obvious exception to that binary. The obvious exception to the sex binary is there are intersex people, and there are just tremendous numbers of intersex people. What I think is increasingly important is when someone tells you something intrinsic to their identity, something that is born into them, it is imperative that you believe them. And I think that that includes, conditions like mental health conditions. It includes, things like other forms of having a differently abled body. Like there are all of these things where when somebody tells you this is true of my experience, this is true of how the world treats me, it is imperative on you to take a second and think about that. You might utterly reject it. They might tell you, I am an alien from Mars. And you might be like, okay, I don't think that's true. But to some degree, just giving them a second of empathy to say, well, I believe that you believe you're an alien from Mars will get you to a place where you're able to start seeing people for who they say they are. You're probably, if you've never met a trans person, you're probably going to struggle with the question of what is a trans person? Because the gender binary is so instilled in us from an early age. I really do think it's easier for people to sort of understand different sexualities because we all remember that moment in puberty when you're suddenly like, oh, interesting. What's this? So I would say, if you struggle to understand trans identities, that's fine. I think it's hard for people who have never questioned their gender identity, who we often call cisgender. We should call cisgender because here's some Latin fun.
Ooh, we churchy people, we love Latin.
Yeah, so people think that cis is this term that trans people invented, and it is not. Trans means across from, and cis means on the same side of in Latin. So when you are cisgender, that means that you exist within the gender that you were, the sex that you were born into. When you are trans, it means you don't exist within that space in some minor way. Now, no one is entirely comfortable with the gender binary, as established. And, if you take this to its logical extension, then literally everybody is trans. And I don't think that's true. But I think, Nate, you seem mostly comfortable being a man, even if you have areas of manhood that are not necessarily how you like to perform masculinity. That was really not true for me. I was really good at performing, but I was not so great at masculinity. And so, like, cis just means on the same side as trans means across from. It's from Latin. It is literally a series of scientific terms, and it is like, I don't know the full story of this, but it is based on how the Romans referred to a certain mountain range.
Huh.
This, like, the cis side of the mountain range was within the polity of whatever, and the trans side was outside that polity. And so,
I think it might be like this is just my revelation knowledge. Rome is built on a series of 8 mountains, so cis
mhm,
would be within the city limits of those mountains, and trans sounds like it'd be on the outside of those.
that is
Yeah.
100% possible. And like, that science just took that term and was like, okay, here's, cis means within, trans means without, and now we have applied it to gender. So trans people did not invent cisgender to oppress cis people. It's just a useful way of talking about yourself if you identify with the gender you were assigned at birth. And if you don't, if you find it constrictive, it is worth asking those questions. It is worth saying, what about this don't I find? What about this do I find constrictive? I think the one useful piece of advice I give everybody is, it's worth examining your gender identity, even if you're cis, even if you're like, you know what, I am a man, but here are these things about masculinity that I don't find useful, that I don't like. Here, I am a woman. Here are these things about womanhood that I don't find useful, that I don't like. Gender is a vast spectrum, and there is a vast spectrum of masculinities and a vast spectrum of femininities. I am a she, her, extremely femme woman, and I have all these things that, like, are interesting to me, that I find useful about womanhood. And there are things where I'm like, I don't know if I entirely like that. And that's true for everybody. And examining your own gender identity, even if you just are like, I'm a cis person, is useful because it helps you see all of the ways the gender binary is set up to oppress and hurt people within our society, which honestly includes cis people. Cis men are hurt by the gender binary. Cis women are hurt by the gender binary. We have all of these ideas of what a man is and what a woman is that don't help anybody, to we can I you probably can recite endless statistics about the ways in which women are disadvantaged throughout society, but men struggle to win child custody cases. Men have a higher problem with mental illness and with suicide because they have been conditioned to believe, I don't need to go to therapy, I don't need to do this. There's a bunch of other issues in which this gender binary affects and hurts men. And I think I am a Christian. I'm Episcopalian, which is like, I love it. It's a great denomination. I love everything about it, but it's kind of about as far out from, like, dude, like the what I think of as the church from having grown up in it as you could possibly get while still being Christian. It's the Pluto of denominations.
Yeah, that our United Methodists share a lot of theological lineage from with the
Yeah,
Episcopalians. We're all
yeah,
offshoots of the Church of England, so they're like our
yes,
sister church.
yes. Hey, well, it's so good to be here and be your sister. I'm Episcopalian, and I'm trying to think about where I was coming in on this. Yes, I think that a thing that is really fascinating to me is, like, I completely lost it. We were talking about ba, 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 ba. A thing that is, I think, really fascinating is, like, this idea of fellowship that we are supposed to have within the church, and how often fellowship within the church gets gendered, and how that kind of doesn't help anybody. I think it is useful for men to have spaces to talk about stuff amongst themselves. I think it is useful for women to have spaces to talk about stuff amongst themselves. um, Non-binary folks often do this, but, like, the second you start creating rigid definitions of what that is when things get tricky and complicated and just hurt people more than they help. So that is a very long answer to say, I think fellowship is a big part of the solution to this problem. But I think that fellowship, even if it's within intra-male Bible groups or whatever, it needs to be open to the idea that all men experience manhood differently, and there is no one template for it. And there are a lot of different ways to be a cis man, and it's good to be open to all of them. So, yeah.
My mind goes to the story of Jacob and Esau. Here you have that toxic masculinity of Esau. I'm big, I'm tough, I'm hairy, I like to kill things, and I'm dumb. And Jacob was he liked to dwell with the women in the tents, is what the scripture says. He liked to cook. He would have been a very different style of man, or very effeminate. It's how the Bible describes him. And God celebrates like Jacob in that time. Then you go to like the classic He-Man of David, who still had his softer side too. And the stories of scripture celebrate that broad diversity of gender expectation, whereas our modern society is it's uncomfortable with gray area. It's uncomfortable with complexity.
The author Austin Hartkey, he's a Christian author. He's has written a book about transness within the Bible. There are a lot of characters in the Bible who are gender nonconforming in some way or another, including Jacob, who has frequently been claimed by trans men as like a example of their sort of their refusal to exist within the gender they were assigned at birth. There's the Ethiopian eunuch who is frequently claimed by trans people. There's Joseph. There's I could list a number of them, but I think the thing to take away from this is we often think of trans people as having just been invented when Caitlyn Jenner came out, like in 2015. But gender non-conforming people have existed for as long as we've had people. If they are in the Bible, and if God indeed celebrates some of them, then that means that, like, if the Bible had wanted to say there should never be any trans people, it could have been a lot more clear. And it's not. It is very much, allowing for those gray areas, allowing for those, spaces. I don't know. I think.
Well, then also, you're right. It could have been more clear on that, but it is quite clear on, loving thy neighbor. Building community.
No, is it? Is it? I don't remember that one.
If you dig in there, it's in that Deuteronomy we're talking about, right?
Perfect. Yeah. Okay. Got it.
Well, my dear friend, it has been absolutely wonderful. We have to head off to our graduation now, but thank you so much for your time and sharing. And let's make it more frequently than every 22 years. How's that sound?
That sounds good. I will try to talk to you again before 2044.
There we go. All right. Well, congratulations when the next little St. James baby starts running around.
Thank you. We really appreciate it. Bye.
God bless.